знов аркуш пише, Ада до Архипа в тиші. Бабин біб розцвів у дощ, буде бабі біб у борщ. Вовк вовцюх вівцю волік, вівчар вовку вила в бік. Горобець з горобеням, галушок несуть горня. Гава з гудзиком картатим газдувала в своїй хаті. Дим димить із димаря, крилась димом вся земля. Емма любить Енеїду, не Елацьку нашу рідну. Є у Єви і Євгена, ген Європи, отакенний.
Мову маєш муштрувати, мову мами й мову тата, мову міст, містечок, сіл, мову мужності і сил.
Жовтий жук купив жилет, жупан, джинси та жакет. За закон про мову за голосує дружно зал. І найменш егоїстична першою не є практично. І поєднує в потоці 45 мільйонів мовців. Її не згасне наша свічка крихітна і невеличка. Йорж, ймовірно, йойка пшов, та дороги не знайшов. Крокодил до крокодила припливав купити мила. Любить Любомира, як він грає гімн на лірі.
Мову маєш муштрувати, мову мами й мову тата, мову міст, містечок, сіл, мову мужності і сил.
Миска масла й макаронів, з'їсть їх Марк, як охолонуть. Ні, не треба нам нещастя, написала Ніні Настя. Обережний Опанас, опануй козацький спас. Простував Петро під ліском, падав папороть, він писком. Рвучко рухається реп, розвеселий, як вертеп. Сумно сунув синій сом у ставочку за селом. Тигренятко з тигром татом тренувалися стрибати. У долині жив удавав, що він все знав. Фірма ферму будувала, фірмі фарби було мало. Хтось хитренький хитрував, мову нам забороняв. Цар цукоче і цика, та живе й цвіте вона. Чернівці, Черкаси й Чоп знають мову й цей хіп-хоп. Шурхотить, щебече мишка, що чита мандрівку, книжку. Який знак, немов козак, вбереже нас від атак. Юний Юрій юшку їв, юшка капала на стіл. Я, як ключик, замикає, але я це не лякає.
Мову маєш муштрувати, мову мами й мову тата, мову міст, містечок, сіл, мову мужності і сил. Муштрувати, мову мами й мову тата, мову маєш муштрувати, мову мами й мову тата, мову маєш муштрувати, мову мами й мову тата, мову маєш муштрувати.
Introducing Ukrainian, the language from the very heart of Eastern Europe. How did it form? What helped it survive and aided its rise despite being banned? How did Ukrainian withstand Russification, and why did it flourish, at least for a short time, soon after Ukraine became a part of the Soviet Union? How did the language live, and what is happening to it today? In this video, we are going to talk about the Ukrainian language, dotting all the I's, or rather Yi, the name of this letter in Ukrainian. Ukrainian is one of the Slavic languages. Slavic languages are of Indo-European origin and are believed to have descended from Proto-Slavic language. Proto-Slavic linguistic unity is hypothetical. Slavic languages had evolved into various languages before any of them were written down. As for the Proto-Ukrainian language, it had basically formed between the 6th and 11th centuries. It developed some of its very own features that still exist in modern Ukrainian. For example, the sound h instead of Proto-Slavic g. From the time of the late 11th to mid-12th centuries, the Ukrainian language had already been formed as a distinct system. Still, we are not exactly sure how Ukrainians spoke in the 11th century. There were no podcasts yet. But we do know the way they wrote, although they had no Facebook. In Kievan Rus, there were two kinds of written language. Kievan Rus was the largest East European state with its center in one of the oldest cities in the region, Kyiv. Church Slavonic was used, mainly for religious purposes, but it was influenced by the common language people spoke. Old East Slavic, known as Old Ukrainian or the Old Kievan language, was the written language of Kievan Rus for secular and cultural purposes. The most well-known texts from that time are the law code Rus Justice, the Tale of Bygone Years Chronicles, as well as Volodymyr Monomakh's Will and the epic poem The Tale of Ihor's Campaign. When typography was invented, elements of the live Ukrainian language kept appearing in texts. Ukrainian scribes understood that both literary and common languages were important. In the late 16th century, linguist Laurentius Zizani compiled the Lexis, a dictionary in which Slavic church terms are explained in common Ukrainian with elements of the language simple people spoke. Another linguist, Meleti Smotritsky, introduced the letter ge for the sound g, used in many words. Just like any other language, Ukrainian was not formed in a vacuum. When Kievan Rus accepted Christianity, the Ukrainian language absorbed a lot of Greek words. The Cyrillic alphabet, created for Slavic languages, was based on the Greek alphabet. Tens and hundreds of Grekisms floated into religious life and documents. Close contact with steppe nomads gave Ukrainians some words of Turkic origin. Communication with Crimean Tatars intensified the process. At the same time, large cities picked up some Latin because of the establishment of Jesuit colleges and other educational facilities. Ukrainian also has many borrowed Yiddish words. By the way, this exchange was bilateral. All of Europe says borscht because in Yiddish, this word is read exactly like that. There have also been words borrowed from other languages: Polish, German, Hungarian, Romanian. This is how every language evolves. And the Ukrainian language also gave some words to other languages. Ukrainianisms exist in the Polish language and in the neighboring, though not related, Hungarian, as well as in Romanian. And Russian too. So the Ukrainian language evolved. It became more versatile, more precise, more melodic, a language for common folk and uncommon texts. But not everybody liked those trends. In the beginning of the 18th century, Ukraine was occupied by the Russian Empire. Tsar Peter I issued a decree banning the publication of books in the Ukrainian Church Slavonic language in Ukraine, so that there be no difference and no special vernacular. 9 years after that, Peter II ordered a rewrite of all state documents from Ukrainian into Russian. In 1763, Catherine II prohibited the use of Ukrainian at the Kiev-Mohyla Academy, but still the language kept surviving and developing. In the late 18th century, the old Ukrainian literary language became obsolete. The last prominent writer of Old Ukrainian was Hryhorij Skovoroda. Many of its elements still existed in the new Ukrainian literary language based on folk vernaculars. The first texts in this version of the language were written by Ivan Kotlяревський, the most popular ones by Taras Shevchenko. The epic poem Eneida by Kotlяревський was published in the late 18th century in St. Petersburg, and the poetry collection Kobzar by Shevchenko was published 42 years later in the same place. Both books became bestsellers and gave a convincing answer to the question of whether modern Ukrainian is good not only for buying vegetables at the market, but also for writing serious literary works, including epic and even prophetic texts. By the way, in those times, folk vernaculars were influencing other literary languages too. In the early 14th century, Dante Alighieri wrote his Divine Comedy in the vernacular of his native region Tuscany, and this book caused the Tuscan dialect to become the foundation of modern Italian. In the Ottoman Empire, people wrote in Ottoman but spoke mostly in crude Turkish, which became the basis of today's literary Turkish language. The Russian Empire continued oppressing the Ukrainian language. Even its name was officially changed into Little Russian, while the actual Russian language was called Great Russian. During the mid-19th to earliest 20th century, there was wave upon wave of censorship laws passed with various bans on the Ukrainian language. The most notorious of them is Valuyev's decree. It banned publishing Ukrainian books for the reason that there never has been, is not, and never can be any separate Little Russian language. There was also the Emsky Decree, which prohibited the use of the language in schools, churches, newspapers, magazines, science, business, in public performances, and in the theater. There was every possible ban, banning giving Ukrainian names to babies, banning the translation of Russian books into Ukrainian, even banning the printing of Ukrainian texts with musical scores. If there was a Ukrainian YouTube channel back then, it would have been banned also. But fortunately, some Ukrainian regions were not subject to Russia. Halachina, Zakarpattia, Bukovina, and Pryashiv region. When the Emsky Decree was being enforced, Ukrainian books were published in Halachina. Therefore, at the beginning of the 20th century, the speech of Kotlяревський and Shevchenko was significantly expanded with words from the western regions. The 20th century was full of dramatic turns in the history of Ukraine and its language. World War I and the Russian Revolution of 1917 became a powerful impetus for independence movements in the lands where Ukrainians lived. Ukrainian governmental infrastructure and political parties were created, and the culture was revived. In the Ukrainian National Republic and in the Ukrainian state, headed by Hetman Pavlo Skoropadsky, Ukrainian became the language of law, administration, the army, and education. Many Ukrainian schools, libraries, and publishing houses were opened at that time, but the rise of Ukrainian culture was brutally interrupted by the Russian Red Army. In its first years after the Soviet occupation of Ukraine, the authorities barely tolerated the Ukrainian language. For example, when the Bolsheviks first occupied Kyiv, they treated the speakers of the literary Ukrainian language as enemies, often executing them. However, after a few years, surprisingly, they started the process called Ukrainization. In the Soviet Union, this policy was called nativization. Local governing bodies were to be staffed by native people. In Ukraine, those natives were mostly rural Ukrainian speakers, so cities were rapidly Ukrainized. The Ukrainian language was introduced at schools and universities, both as a subject and as the language of study. Most of the books, newspapers, and magazines were published in Ukrainian. Ukrainian theater and cinema also flourished. Moreover, Ukrainization was taking place in other territories of the Soviet Union where Ukrainians lived. Therefore, not only the Kuban region spoke and wrote Ukrainian, but also Kursk, Voronezh, and even Zelenay Klin in the Far East. So, in those years, the Ukrainian language could be heard even on the coast of the Sea of Japan. And the language was not only spreading, it was developing. A standardized grammar was established. 3 volumes of a Russian-Ukrainian dictionary were published, edited by Ahatanhel Krimsky and Serhiy Yefremov. But the final 4th volume was not published. In the early 1930s, it became clear that Ukrainization was a means, not an end. Communists needed nativization for their political reasons. As soon as the locals felt loyal to the new authorities, Soviets no longer needed this policy. In 1932, Ukrainization stopped and repressions followed. Many linguists, writers, dramatists, stage directors, and scientists were imprisoned and killed. The newly published dictionaries and grammar books were all discarded as bourgeois and nationalistic. Loyal scholars were made to create new dictionaries in order to eliminate all the artificial barriers between Ukrainian and Russian. Soviet authorities were interfering into the very dynamics of language. They started to ban some words, syntax, and grammatical forms. Instead, they imposed those that were closer to Russian. The more similar to Russian, the better. And even the letter G was banned as nationalistic. Russian was imposed in almost all educational establishments. During the decades of this policy, many writers, linguists, and other educated people tried to resist this in various forms. Even in Stalinistic times, Maxim Rylsky, a prominent poet and translator, wrote in the largest literary newspaper of Soviet Ukraine. The system of decrees, bans, and limitations, and administrative control cannot be useful for language development. In the 60s and 70s, Boris Antonenko Davidovich put forth the question of returning the letter G. Ivan Svetlichny criticized the Russian-Ukrainian dictionary of 1948 for its Russification, but in later years secretly worked on a Ukrainian dictionary of synonyms in a prison camp. The most radical act against Russification was the self-immolation of Ukrainian Oleksa Hirnik in 1978. Ukraine became independent in 1991. What did that mean for the Ukrainian language? Ukrainian was proclaimed the only state language. More schools started to teach children in Ukrainian and to have more lessons in the Ukrainian language. In universities, entrance exams were taken in Ukrainian, and the Ukrainian language exam became compulsory. New publishing houses were founded, and original as well as translated books were published. But 300 years of Russification had its effects. Many people still regard Russian as the language of higher culture. This idea was imposed for a long time. They preferred less expensive books imported from Russia. And although there were many talented Ukrainian bands and singers, Russian pop music was regarded as more prestigious by many people. In the press, on television, in the movies, Russian dominated. Some changes came with the Orange Revolution. For example, quotas are set for music and broadcasting in the Ukrainian language on television and radio stations. Foreign films were to be dubbed into Ukrainian or to have Ukrainian subtitles. Although Russian distributors were predicting that the audience wouldn't like it, people were still going to cinemas all over Ukraine. After the election of pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych, previous achievements were attempted to be reversed. People did not like this, and they started the language Maidan. The presidency ended after the Revolution of Dignity. New Ukrainization started. The Ukrainian language dominated in all educational facilities. Children of national minorities had the right to study in their native language. The Ukrainian Cultural Fund, the Ukrainian Book Institute, and the Ukrainian Institute were founded. New films were shot in Ukrainian, many of them becoming box office hits. In 2019, a law was finally passed that expanded the use of the official language, in particular, the service industry, education, television, and radio broadcasting. And what is the Ukrainian language like today? It has a number of dialects. Scholars divide the Ukrainian language into three major dialects: Northern, or Polesian, Southwestern, and Southeastern. These are divided into 15 sub-dialects. There is also a diaspora, our color around the world. At various times, Ukrainian immigrants took their language abroad with them. It was preserved there, although with some new words. At the same time in Ukraine, the language was changing because of communization, Russification, and simply because some new objects or phenomena appeared. This is why diaspora speech sometimes sounds different from that of Ukrainians. Another phenomena of today's Ukrainian language is surjik, the Ukrainian-Russian mix. Sometimes writers, editors, and translators use surjik to create a circle of trust or an atmosphere of comfort. In the Soviet Union, because of the effects of propaganda, many people spoke Russian. But today, more and more Ukrainians choose to speak Ukrainian. Ukrainians speaking Ukraine is united. Many centuries have passed, but Ukraine and the Ukrainian language continue to defend themselves from Russian aggression.
Ukrainian is an East Slavic language of the Indo-European language family. It is the native language of about 40 million people and the official state language of Ukraine in Eastern Europe. Historical linguists trace the origin of the Ukrainian language to Old East Slavic and language of the early medieval state of Kievska Rus. After the fall of the Kievska Rus as well as the Kingdom of Ruthenia, the language developed into a form called the Ruthenian language and enjoyed as such the status of one of the official language of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania for several centuries. Along with Ruthenian in the territory of modern Ukraine, the Kiev version, Kiev Izvod, of Church Slavonic was also used in liturgical services. The Ukrainian language has been in common use since the late 17th century, associated with the establishment of the Cossack Hetmanate from 1804 until the 1918-1923 Ukrainian War of Independence. The Ukrainian language was banned from schools in the Russian Empire, of which the biggest part of Ukraine, central, eastern and southern, was a part of the time. Through folk songs, itinerant musicians and prominent authors, the language has always maintained a sufficient base in Western Ukraine, where the language was never banned. Ukrainian linguist Stepan Smolstotsky denies the existence of a common Old East Slavic language at any time in the past. Similar points of view were shared by Yevhen Timchenko, Vsevolod Hantsov, Olena Kovalenko, Ivan Gienko and others. According to this theory, the dialects of East Slavic tribes evolved gradually from the common Proto-Slavic language without any intermediate stage during the 6th through and 9th centuries. The Ukrainian language was formed by a convergence of tribal dialects, mostly due to an intensive migration of the population within the territory of today's Ukraine in later historical periods. This point of view was also supported by Georgy Shevelov phonological studies. During the 30th century, when German settlers were invited to Ukraine by the princes of Kingdom of Ruthenia, German words began to appear in the language spoken in Ukraine. Their influence would continue under Poland, not only through German colonists, but also through the Yiddish-speaking Jews. Often such words involve trade or handicrafts. Example of words of German and Yiddish origin spoken in Ukraine include dach, roof, rura, pipe, rynok, market, kushnir, foyer, and meister, master of craftsmen. In the 13th century, eastern parts of Kievska Rus, including Moscow, came under Tatar rule until the unification under the Tsardom of Muscovy, whereas the southwestern areas, including Kiev, were incorporated into the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. For the following 4 centuries, the language on the two regions evolved in relative isolation from each other. Polish rule and education also involved significant exposure to the Latin language. Much of the influence of Poland in the development of the Ukrainian language has been attributed to this period and is reflected in multiple words and construction used in everyday Ukrainian speech that were taken from Polish and Latin. Examples of Polish words adapted from this period include zawsze, always, taken from Old Polish word zawsze, and obiecjate, to promise, taken from Polish obiecać, and from Latin via Polish raptum, suddenly, and meta, aim or goal. The Polish language has had heavy influence on Ukrainian, particularly in Western Ukraine, with southwestern Ukraine dialects and transitional to Polish. As the Ukrainian language developed, there were some borrowings from Tatar and Turkish occurred. Ukrainian culture and language flourished in 16th and first half of the 17th century, when Ukraine was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, albeit in spite of being part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, not as a result. Among many schools established in the time, Kievo-Mohyla Collegium, the predecessor of modern Kievo-Mohylanska Academia, founded by Moldavian Orthodox Metropolitan Petro Mohyla, was the most important, and wartime languages were associated more with religions. Catholics spoke Polish, and members of the Orthodox Church spoke Ruthenian. Significant contact with Tatars and Turks resulted in many Turkic words, particularly those involving military matters and steppe industry, being adopted in the Ukrainian language. Example include torba, bag, and tytun, tobacco. Due to heavy borrowings from Polish, German, Czech, and Latin, early modern vernacular Ukrainian simple speech had more lexical similarity with West Slavic languages, one with Russian or Church Slavonic. By the mid-17th century, the linguistic divergence between Ukrainian and Russian languages had become so significant that there was a need for translators during negotiations for a Treaty of Pereyaslav between Bogdan Khmelnytsky, head of the Zaporizhia host, and the Russian state. The fact is what with the rise of the Russian Empire, the Ukrainian version of the Church Slavonic language began to be replaced by Russian, From 1720 year, with decree of Peter the Great of the left bank Ukraine allowed the printing of books only the Russian version. With decree of 1729 required the rewriting of a government decree and order from Ukrainian to Russian. From 1740 all the records of the Hetmanate were to be kept in Russian. In 1794 the Metropolitan of Kiev Samuel Myslavsky issued a new decree that made the Russian version of Church Slavonic obligatory for the Kievo-Mohylanska Academy. From Russia's point of view, it was a movement towards the standardization of language, but from the point of view of Ukrainian Academy, with its centuries-old book and literary traditions, with their repression and prohibitions. Intelligentsia found an alternative. We began to use in living spoken local language and writing because no one had been in yet. In 1798, Ivan Kotlяревский Aeneida was published in St. Petersburg as an attempt, a game and provocation. Aeneida was indeed a popular work among the intellectuals of the time, but reading in the vernacular language was strange and unusual, so there arose a controversy of what the Ukrainian literary language should be, whether it could be used to write serious work, not only humorous ones. In the year 1830, other works by Kotlяревский written in the vernacular were published in Kharkiv, the place Natolka Poltavka, and Moskal Cherimik, the Muscovite sorcerer, and Grigory Kvitka Osnovyanenko novels, among which very not all humorous, but serious works such as Marusia. In the year 1840, Shevchenko's Kobzar was published in St. Petersburg. Shevchenko's uniqueness is that he, a native of Dnipranshchina, used his local dialect in his poems, but selected the words that very clear to every Ukrainian, no matter where they come from, which gave Shevchenko's poetry an old Ukrainian character. In Dnipranshchina, translations of the iconic works of world literature, the Bible, works by Shakespeare, Goethe, Byron, Heine, were published in the living Ukrainian language. At the same time in Halachina, which was part of another empire, Austro-Hungarian, similar processes took place as in Greater Ukraine. In 1848, the first newspaper in Ukrainian vernacular, Zorya Halitska, was published in Lviv. With 1830 and 1860, were the years of cultural revival in both central, eastern and western Ukrainian lands, when many ethnographic materials, Ukrainian language sermons, and teaching materials on the Ukrainian language were published. In 1863, the Tsarist Interior Minister Pyotr Valuyev proclaimed in his decree that there never has been, is not, and never can be a separate Little Russian language. With decree prohibited the publication of books in Ukrainian, including those based on the vernacular language. First all except fiction, when all including fiction and even musical notation. William's decree also prohibited the use of the Ukrainian language in schools, churches, journalism, newspapers, magazines, science, formal documents, translations, public speeches, theater. Banned across the Russian Empire by the Valuyev Circular and the Ems Ukaz. Book publishing in Ukrainian had to move to whose Ukrainian lands, what did not belong to the empire, and what time, Halachina and Bukovina, when the local authors understood that one day Ukraine will become united, so they aspired to become part of Greater Ukraine and focused in the literary language. During the 7-decade-long Soviet era, the Ukrainian language held the formal position of the principal local language in Ukrainian SSSR. However, practice was often a different story. Ukrainian always had to compete with Russian, and the attitudes of the Soviet leadership towards Ukrainian varied from encouragement and tolerance to de facto banishment. Following the Russian Revolution, the Russian Empire was broken up in different parts of the former empire. Several nations, including Ukrainians, developed and renewed its sense of national identity. In the chaotic post-revolutionary years, in the Ukrainian language gained some usage in government affairs. Widening use of Ukrainian further developed in the first years of Bolshevik rule into a policy called Koreanization. The government pursued a policy of Ukrainization by lifting a ban of the Ukrainian language, what led to the introduction of an impressive education program which allowed Ukrainian taught classes and raised the literacy of the Ukrainophone population. This policy was led by Education Commissar Mykola Skripnik and was directed to approximate the language to Russian. Newly generated academic efforts from the period of independence were co-opted by Bolshevik government. The party and government apparatus was mostly Russian-speaking but very encouraged the learning in the Ukrainian language. Simultaneously, the newly literate ethnic Ukrainians migrated to the cities, which became rapidly largely Ukrainians in both population and education. The policy even reached to whose regions of southern Russian SFSR where the ethnic Ukrainian population was significant, particularly the areas by the Don River and especially Kuban in the North Caucasus. Ukrainian language teachers just graduated from expanded institution of higher education in Soviet Ukraine were dispatched to these regions to staff newly opened Ukrainian schools or to teach Ukrainian as a second language in Russian schools. A string of local Ukrainian language publications were started and departments of Ukrainian studies were opened in colleges. Overall, these policies were implemented in 35 rayons administrative districts in southern Russia. It was during the time of the Central Rada what the term Ukrainization was first used. Ukrainian was introduced in schools. Ukrainian language educational institutions were opened, including the Ukrainian People's University, the Scientific Pedagogical Academy, and the Academy of Arts. Of course, there was a lack of textbooks, terminology, and specialists, so in the summer of 1918, there were about 100 courses in Ukrainian studies for teachers, and the private schools educational society started publishing schools textbook. For educating adults, the Prosvita network was created, which had its own libraries, organizing lectures. During the Hetmanat, the government promoted the Ukrainization of primary schools. We opened new secondary and high schools with Ukrainian as the language of instruction were retaining the Russian ones what already existed. We later would open departments of Ukrainian studies, also very summer courses in Ukrainian studies to increase the prestige of the Ukrainian language and culture. State institutions were established, the National Library, the Ukrainian Academy of Science, very dialectical, orthographic, and terminological commissions functioned. The most important rules of Ukrainian spelling were approved. Regarding the period of the Directorate immediately after coming to power on January 3, 1990, it issued the law of the state language in the Ukrainian People's Republic, which required the use of Ukrainian in the army, navy, government, and other public institutions, citizens having the right to turn to state institutions in their native languages. Ukrainian was made a compulsory subject in higher education establishments. Revolutionary events and the national liberation movement in mainland Ukraine affected the sailors of the Black Sea Fleet, whose personnel were 78% Ukrainians, and the time so greatly what they became the nucleus and main engine of the Ukrainian Sevastopol community. By the end of April 1918, Ukrainian soldiers formed a great number of Ukrainian clubs and councils and their land unions and own ships. The Ukrainian publishing house Atos was founded in Simferopol. If in 1922 very were no Ukrainian language newspapers, in 1933 very were 373 out of a total of 426 titles and 89 magazines out of 118. It is recorded that in 1933, 83% of books in the USSR were published in Ukrainian. In 1933, 66 theaters out of 88 staged plays in Ukrainian. Soviet policy towards the Ukrainian language changed abruptly in late 1932 and early 1933 with the termination of the policy of Ukrainization. In December 1932, the regional party cells received a telegram signed by Molotov and Stalin with an order to immediately reverse the Ukrainization policy. Telegram condemned Ukrainization and ill-considerate and harmful and demanded to immediately halt Ukrainization in districts, switch all Ukrainized newspapers, books and publications into Russian and prepared by autumn of 1933 for the switching of schools and instruction into Russian. Stalinist policies shifted to define Russian as the language of inter-ethnic communication. Although Ukrainian continued to be used in print, education, radio and later television programs, it lost its primary place in advanced learning and republic-wide media. Ukrainian was demoted to a language of secondary importance, often associated with the rise in Ukrainian self-awareness and nationalism and often branded politically incorrect. The new Soviet constitution adopted in 1956, however, stipulated what teaching in schools shall be conducted in native languages. This sequence of policies change was repeated in Western Ukraine when it was incorporated into Soviet Ukraine in 1939 and again in the late 1940. A policy of Ukrainization was implemented. By the early 1950, Ukrainian was persecuted and campaign Russification began. After the death of Stalin, 1933, a general policy of relaxing the language policy of the past was implemented of 1958 to 1963. The Khrushchev era, which followed, saw a policy of relatively lenient concessions to the development of languages at the local and republic level. Tough its results in Ukraine did not go nearly as far as whose of the Soviet policy of Ukrainization. In the 1920, journals and encyclopedic publication advancing in Ukrainian language during the Khrushchev era, as well as transfer of Crimea under Ukrainian SSSR jurisdiction. Yet the 1958 school reform what allowed parents to choose the language of primary instruction for their children, unpopular among the circles of the national intelligentsia in parts of USSR, meant what non-Russian languages would slowly give way to Russian in light of the pressure of survival and advancement. In this sense, some analysts argue what it was not the oppression or persecution, but rather the lack of protection against the expansion of Russian language, what contributed to the relative decline of Ukrainian in the 1970 and 1980. According to this view, it was inevitable what successful careers required a good command of Russian, while knowledge of Ukrainian was not vital, so it was common for Ukrainian parents to send their children to Russian language schools, even though Ukrainian language schools were usually available. Ukrainian language schools were usually available, while in the Russian language schools within the Republic Ukrainian was supposed to be learned as a second language at comparable level. The instruction of other subjects was in Russian, and as a result, students had a greater command of Russian than Ukrainian on graduation. Additionally, in some areas of the Republic, the attitude towards teaching and learning of Ukrainian in schools was relaxed, and it was sometimes considered a subject of secondary importance, and even a waiver from studying it was sometimes given under various ever-expanding circumstances. The complete suppression of or expression of separatism or Ukrainian nationalism also contributed to loosening interest in Ukrainian. Some people who persistently used Ukrainian on a daily basis very often perceived and stuffed away very expressing sympathy towards or even being members of political opposition. With combined with advantages given by Russian fluency and usage, made Russian the primary language of choice for many Ukrainians, while Ukrainian was more of a hobby. In any event, the multi-liberalization in Ukraine and elsewhere was stifled by new suppression of freedoms and the end of Khrushchev era 1963, when a policy of gradually creeping suppression of Ukrainian was reinstituted. The next part of the Soviet-Ukrainian language policy divides in two eras. First, this Shelest period, early 1960 to early 1970, which was relatively liberal towards the development of Ukrainian language. The second era, the policy of Shcherbitsky, early 1970 to early 1990, was one of gradual suppression of Ukrainian language. The Communist Party leader from 1963 to 1972, Petro Shelest, pursued a policy of defending Ukraine's interest within the Soviet Union. He proudly promoted the beauty of Ukrainian language and developed plans to expand the role of Ukrainian in higher education. He was removed, however, after only a brief tenure for being too lenient on Ukrainian nationalism. The new party was from 1972 to 1989. Volodymyr Tyravskyi purged the local party, was fierce in suppressing dissent, and insisted a Russian be spoken in all official function, even at local levels. His policy of Russification was lessened only slightly after 1975. The management of dissent by the local Ukrainian Communist Party was more fierce and through what than other parts of the Soviet Union. As a result, at the start of Mikhail Gorbachev reforms, Perbudova and Glasnost, Ukrainian for Perestroika and Glasnost, Ukraine under Shcherbitsky was slower to liberalize than Russia itself. Although Ukrainian still remained the native language for majority of the nation on the eve of Ukrainian independence, a significant share of ethnic Ukrainians were Russified. In Donetsk there were no Ukrainian language schools, and in Kiev only a quarter of children went to Ukrainian language schools. The Russian language was the dominant vehicle not just of government in function but with media, commerce and modernity itself. This was substantially less the case for Western Ukraine, which escaped the artificial famine, Great Purge and most of Stalinism, and this region became the center of hearty, if only partial, renaissance of the Ukrainian language during independence. 2 years before independence in 1989, when the Soviet Union was undergoing perestroika, the law on languages in the Ukrainian SSR was passed, stating that the Ukrainian SSR gives Ukrainian with status of state language. This status was specified in the Constitution of Independent Ukraine 1996. Since 1991, Ukrainian has been the official state language in Ukraine, and the state administration implemented government policy to broaden the use of Ukrainian. The educational system in Ukraine has been transformed over the first decade of independence from a system what is partly Ukrainian to one what is or overwhelmingly so. The government has also mandated a progressively increased role for Ukrainian in the media and commerce. In some cases, the abrupt changing of the language of instruction of an institution of secondary and higher education led to the charges of Ukrainization raised mostly by the Russian-speaking population. This transition, however, lacked most of the controversies what arose during the derussification of the other former Soviet republics. In the 2000 to the first census, 67.5% of the country's population named Ukrainian as their native language, a 2.8% increase from 1,989, while 29.6% named Russian and 3.2% decrease. On the other hand, there was no balanced language policy that will help overcome diglossia, and Ukrainian continued to lose to Russian in many areas. The number of schools with Ukrainian as the language of instruction was growing, the number of hours for studying increased, admission campaigns in university were conducted in the state language, Ukrainian language exam became mandatory. These were all important achievements, however, in the media Russian-dominated branches of Russian mass media very open in Ukraine. Although interesting Ukrainian-speaking performs, Russian remained a more prestigious language in show business. Publishing books in Ukrainian has long been a matter of enthusiasm rather than a real business, and the domestic market was not protected or promoted at the state level. Again, books were imported from Russia without hindrance, way very cheaper than Ukrainian ones due to the larger circulation. In this case, the prime cost of each book is lower. Likewise, Russian-made films and Russian TV channels were broadcast without hindrance. Films from other countries were dubbed into Russian, or Russian-dubbed products were bought in Russia. After the Orange Revolution, there were some changes, primarily in the field of media. Quotas were set at 50% for broadcasting and music in Ukrainian on all TV and radio stations. During 2006-2008 years, a number of government decrees required distributors to dub and or subtitle all foreign films in Ukrainian. Under the pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych, attempts were made to overturn the preceding president's achievements in terms of language. These attempts included a decision to replace mandatory dubbing of films in Ukrainian by a resolution on mandatory dubbing of films in Ukraine, no matter what language, and mandatory subtitling on films in Ukrainian if the film is dubbed in another language. At the time, the so-called Kolesnichenko-Kivalov law was also adopted, which expanded the use of other languages in Ukraine, primarily Russian, in practice. The period from 2014 to 2019, after the victory of the Revolution of Dignity, can be called a new round of Ukrainization. Significant change started to take place in a key area of language use education. In 2017, a new law on education was adopted, until when in Ukraine we studied and taught according to the law adopted before the proclamation of independence in May 1091. In March 2020, the law of Ukraine on complete general secondary education was passed. It mandates teaching on Ukrainian in secondary school. In 2019, the law of Ukraine on ensuring the functioning of the Ukrainian language as the state language was finally adopted. Immediately after its articles came into force, there was an increase in the use of Ukrainian in the public sphere, including in the Verkhovna Rada, in local governments. The service sector has also seen striking changes. In addition, during this period in 2014 to 2019, cultural institutions were established. Culture. The Ukrainian Cultural Foundation, the Ukrainian Book Institute, the Ukrainian Institute. All of these institutions were designed to support Ukrainian culture, to replenish it with new models, and to promote it. Significant funds were invested in the development of cinema and other creative industries during this period. This is evidenced in particular by the fact that in 2014 to 2019, 110 films of Ukrainian production were released, the overwhelming majority of them in Ukrainian. Ukrainian is a fusional nominative accusative satellite frame language. It exhibits TV distinction and is null subject. Nouns have one of three genders, masculine, feminine, neuter. Nouns decline for 7 cases: nominative, accusative, genitive, dative, instrumental, locative, vocative. 2 numbers, singular, plural. Adjectives agree with nouns in gender, case, and number. Verbs conjugate for 4 tenses: past, pluperfect, present, future. 2 voices: active, medio, passive. 3 persons: first, second, third. 2 numbers, singular, plural. Ukrainian verbs come in aspect pairs, perfective and imperfective. Pairs are usually formed by a prepositional prefix and occasionally a root change. The past tense agrees with its subject in number and gender, but not person, having developed from the perfect participle. The Ukrainian language has 6 vowels, and number of the consonants come in 3 forms: hard, soft, palatalized, and long. Ukrainian is written in version of Cyrillic, consisting of 53 letters, representing 58 phonemes. An apostrophe is also used. The Ukrainian orthography is based on the phonemic principles, with 1 letter generally corresponding to 1 phoneme, although there are a number of exceptions. The orthography also has cases where the semantic, historical, and morphological principles are applied.
Українська мова, мова барвінкова, в лузі запашнім, квітка польова. Поруч ти зі мною чаруєш красою, у серцях гарячих ти жива. Мова стоплива, дзвінка і грайлива, мелодійна лива, сонячна пуста, веселково ніжна, і розкішна, лікуєш серце і уста. Мова лебедина, ти одна єдина, ти як соловейка, пісня у гаю. Мова калинова, дивна, загадкова, рідну свою мову я люблю. Українська мова, лагідна, святкова, будеш ти з народом завжди навіки. Тож шануймо мову, бережімо мову, що дали навіки нам батьки. Мова лебедина, ти одна єдина, ти як соловейка, пісня у гаю. Мова калинова, дивна, загадкова, рідну свою мову я люблю. Мова лебедина, ти одна єдина, ти як соловейка, пісня у гаю. Мова калинова, дивна, загадкова, рідну свою мову я люблю.
себе, дитино, хто ти є, і в серці обізветься рідна мова, і в голосі яснім ім'я твоє просяє, наче зірка світанкова. У просторах, яким немає меж, ти не загубишся, як на вітрах полова. Моря перелетиш і не впадеш, допоки буде в серці рідна мова. Моря перелетиш і не впадеш, допоки буде в серці рідна мова. Рідна мова з родинного гнізда, немов пташа, ти полетиш, де світу далечина, та в рідній мові буде вся душа, і вся твоя дорога, вся вітчизна. У просторах, яким немає меж, ти не загубишся, як на вітрах полова. Моря перелетиш і не впадеш, допоки буде в серці рідна мова. Моря перелетиш і не впадеш, допоки буде в серці рідна мова. Рідна мова. Яким немає меж, ти не загубишся, як на вітрах полова. Моря